Chapter 16. It was with great pleasure that Mark found himself once more dressing for dinner, and what seemed likely to be an excellent one. He got a seat with Philostrato on his right and a rather inconspicuous newcomer on his left. Even Philostrato seemed human and friendly compared with the two initiates, and to the newcomer his heart positively warmed. He noticed with surprise that the tramp sat at the high table between Jules and Wither, but he did not look in that direction, for the tramp, catching his eye, had imprudently raised his glass and winked at him. The strange priest stood patiently behind the tramp's chair. For the rest, nothing of importance happened until the king's health had been drunk, and Jules rose to make his speech. For the first few minutes, anyone glancing down the long tables would have seen what we always see on such occasions. There were the placid faces of elderly bons viveurs, whom food and wine had placed in a contentment which no amount of speeches could violate. There were the patient faces of responsible but serious diners, who had long since learned how to pursue their own thoughts while attending to the speech just enough to respond wherever a laugh or a low rumble of serious assent was obligatory. There was the usual fidgety expression on the faces of young men unappreciative of port and hungry for tobacco. There was the bright, over-elaborate attention on the powdered faces of women who knew their duty to society. But if you had gone on looking down the tables, you would have presently seen a change. You would have seen face after face look up and turn in the direction of the speaker. You would have seen first curiosity, then fixed attention, then incredulity. Finally, you would have noticed the room was utterly silent, without cough or creak, that every eye was fixed on Jules, and soon every mouth opened in something between fascination and horror. To different members of the audience, the change came differently. To Frost, it began at the moment when he heard Jules end a sentence with the words,
"As gross an anachronism as to trust to cavalry for salvation in modern war." Cavalry,
thought Frost almost aloud. Why couldn't the fool mind what he was saying? The blunder irritated him extremely. Perhaps, but hello, what was this? Had his hearing gone wrong? For Jules seemed to be saying the future density of mankind depended on the implosion of the horses of nature.
"He's drunk,"
thought Frost. Then, crystal clear in articulation, beyond all possibility of mistake, came,
"The madrigal of virtues must be Talibanianized."
Wither was slower to notice what was happening. He had never expected the speech to have any meaning as a whole, and for a long time the familiar catchwords rolled on in a manner which did not disturb the expectation of his ear. He thought indeed that Jules was sailing very near the wind, that a very small false step would deprive both speaker and audience of the power even to pretend he was saying anything in particular. But as long as that border was not crossed, he rather admired the speech. It was in his own line. Then he thought,
Come, that's going too far. Even they must see you can't talk about accepting the challenge of the past by throwing down the gauntlet of the future.
He looked cautiously down the room. All was well, but it wouldn't be if Jules didn't sit down pretty soon. In that last sentence there were surely words he didn't know. What the deuce did he mean by a holibate? He looked down the room again. They were attending too much, always a bad sign. Then came the sentence,
"The surrogates is implanted in a continual of porous variations."
Mark did not at first attend to the speech at all. He had plenty of other things to think of. The appearance of this spouting popinjay at the very crisis of his own history was a mere interruption. He was too endangered, and yet also, in some precarious way, too happy to bother about Jules. Once or twice some phrase caught his ear and made him want to smile. What first awoke him to the real situation was the behaviors of those who sat near him. He was aware of their increasing stillness. He noticed everyone except himself had begun to attend. He looked up and saw their faces, and then first he really listened.
We shall not till we can secure the erebation of all posterundiary nitterns."
Little as he cared for Jules, a sudden shock of alarm pierced him. He looked round again. Obviously it was not he who was mad. They had all heard the gibberish, except possibly the tramp, who looked as solemn as a judge. He had never heard a speech from one of those real toffs before, and would have been disappointed if he could understand it. Nor had he ever before drunk vintage port, and though he did not much like the taste, he had been working away like a man. Wither had not forgotten for a moment there were reporters present. That in itself did not matter much. If anything unsuitable appeared in tomorrow's paper, it would be child's play for him to say the reporters were drunk or mad and break them. On the other hand, he might let the story pass. Jules was in many respects a nuisance, and this might be as good an opportunity as any for ending his career. But this was not the immediate question. Wither was wondering whether he should wait till Jules sat down, or whether he should rise and interrupt him with a few judicious words. But he did not want a scene. It would be better if Jules sat down of his own accord. At the same time, there was by now an atmosphere in that crowded room which warned Wither not to delay too long. Glancing down at the second hand of his watch, he decided to wait 2 minutes more. Almost as he did so, he knew that he had misjudged it. An intolerable falsetto laugh rang out from the bottom of the table and would not stop. Some fool of a woman had got hysterics. Immediately, Wither touched Jules on the arm, signed to him with a nod, and rose.
Will do.
Wither, laying his hand on the little man's shoulder, quietly but with all his weight, forced him to a sitting position. Then Wither cleared his throat. He knew how to do that so that every eye in the room turned immediately to look at him. The woman stopped screaming. People who had been sitting dead still in strained positions moved and relaxed. Wither looked down the room for a second or two in silence, feeling his grip on the audience. He saw he already had them in hand. There would be no more hysterics. Then he began to speak. They ought to have all looked more and more comfortable as he proceeded, and there ought soon to have been murmurs of grave regret for the tragedy they had just witnessed. That was what Wither expected. What he actually saw bewildered him. The same too attentive silence which had prevailed during Jules' speech had returned. Bright, unblinking eyes and open mouths greeted him in every direction. The woman began to laugh again. No, this time it was two women. Cosser, after one frightened glance, jumped up, overturning his chair, and bolted from the room. The deputy director could not understand this, for to him his own voice seemed to be uttering the speech he had resolved to make. But the audience heard him saying,
Tidies and fuglemen, I see afore that we all, most deeply rebute the defensible, though I trust, laboratory aphasia which gleams to have selected a redeemed inspector this deceiving. It would, be shock, very shock from anyone's debaucher.
The woman who had laughed rose hastily from her chair. The man seated next to her heard her murmur in his ear. He took in the meaningless syllables and her unnatural expression at one moment. Both, for some reason, infuriated him. He rose to help her to move back her chair with one of those gestures of savage politeness which often, in modern society, serve instead of blows. He wrenched the chair, in fact, out of her hand. She screamed, tripped on a ruck in the carpet, and fell. The man on the other side of her saw the fall and saw the first man's expression of fury. "What are you, blam it?" he roared, leaning toward him with a threatening movement. 4 or 5 people in the part of the room were now up. They were shouting. At the same time there was movement elsewhere. Several of the younger men were making for the door. "Bundlemen! Bundlemen!" said Withers sternly in a much louder voice. He had often before, merely by raising his voice and speaking one authoritative word, reduced troublesome meetings to order. But this time he was not even heard. At least 20 people present were at the very moment attempting to do the same thing. To each of them it seemed plain that things were just at that stage when a word or so of plain sense, spoken in a new voice, would restore the whole room to sanity. One thought of a sharp word, one of a joke, one of something very quiet and telling. As a result, fresh gibberish at a great variety of tones rang out from several places at once. Frost was the only one of the leaders who attempted to say nothing. Instead, he penciled a few words on a slip of paper, beckoned to his servant, and made him understand by signs that it was to be given to Miss Hardcastle. By the time the message was put into her hands, the clamor was universal. To Mark, it sounded like the noise of a crowded restaurant in a foreign country. Miss Hardcastle smoothed out the paper and stooped her head to read. The message ran,
Blunt frippers intently to pointed bdelroid. Urgent. Cost.
She crumpled it up in her hand. Miss Hardcastle had known before she got the message that she was 3 parts drunk. She had expected and intended to be so. She knew later on in the evening she would go to the cells and do things. There was a new prisoner there, a little fluffy girl of that kind the fairy enjoyed, with whom she could pass an agreeable hour. The tumult of gibberish did not alarm her. She found it exciting. Apparently Frost wanted her to take some action. She decided she would. She rose and walked the whole length of the room to the door, locked it, put the key in her pocket, and then turned to survey the company. She noticed for the first time that neither the supposed Merlin nor the Bosque priest were anywhere to be seen. Wither and Jules, both on their feet, were struggling with each other. She set out toward them. So many people had now risen that it took her a long time to reach them. All semblance of a dinner party had vanished. It was more like the scene at a London terminus on a bank holiday. Everyone was trying to restore order, but everyone was unintelligible. And everyone, in the effort to be understood, was talking louder and louder. She shouted several times herself. She even fought a good deal before she reached her goal. There came an ear-splitting noise, and after that, at last, a few seconds of dead silence. Mark noticed first that Jules had been killed. Only secondly, that Miss Hardcastle had shot him. After that, it was difficult to be sure what happened. The stampede and shouting may have concealed a dozen reasonable plans for disarming the murderess, but it was impossible to concert them. Nothing came of them but kicking, struggling, leaping on tables and under tables, pressing on and pulling back, screams, breaking of glass. She fired again and again. It was the smell, more than anything else, which recalled the scene to Mark in later life. The smell of the shooting mixed with the sticky compound smell of blood and port and Madeira. Suddenly the confusion of cries ran all together into one thin, long-drawn noise of terror. Everyone had become more frightened. Something had darted very quickly across the room between two long tables and vanished beneath one of them. Perhaps half the people present had not seen what it was, had only caught a gleam of black and tawny. Those who had seen it clearly could not tell the others. They could only point and scream meaningless syllables. But Mark had recognized it. It was a tiger. For the first time that evening, everybody realized how many hiding places the room contained. The tiger might be under any of the tables. It might be in any of the deep bay windows behind the curtains. There was a screen across one corner of the room as well. It is not to be supposed that even now none of the company kept their heads. With loud appeals to the whole room or with urgent whispers to their immediate neighbors, they tried to stem the panic, to arrange an orderly retreat from the room, to indicate how the brute could be lured or scared into the open and shot. But the doom of gibberish frustrated all their efforts. They could not arrest the two movements which were going on. The majority had not seen Miss Hardcastle lock the door. They were pressing toward it to get out at all costs. They would fight. They would kill if they could, rather than not reach the door. A large minority, on the other hand, knew the door was locked. There must be another door, the one used by servants, the one whereby the tiger had got in. They were pressing to the opposite end of the room to find it. The whole center of the room was occupied by the meeting of these two waves, a huge football scrum, at first noisy with frantic efforts at explanation, but soon as the struggle thickened, almost silent except for the sound of laboring breath, kicking or trampling feet, and meaningless muttering. 4 or 5 of these combatants lurched heavily against the table, pulling off the cloth in their fall, and with it all the fruit dishes, decanters, glasses, plates. Out of that confusion, with a howl of terror, broke the tiger. It happened so quickly, Mark hardly took it in. He saw the hideous head, the cat's snarl of the mouth, the flaming eyes. He heard a shot, the last. Then the tiger had disappeared again. Something fat and white and bloodied was down among the feet of the scrummers. Mark could not recognize it at first, for the face, from where he stood, was upside down, and the grimaces disquieted it until it was quite dead. Then he recognized Miss Hardcastle. Wither and Frost were no longer to be seen. There was a growling close at hand. Mark turned, thinking he had located the tiger. Then he caught out of the corner of his eye a glimpse of something smaller and grayer. He thought it was an Alsatian. If so, the dog was mad. It ran along the table, its tail between its legs, slavering. A woman standing with her back to the table turned, saw it, tried to scream, next moment went down as the creature leaped at her throat. It was a wolf. Philostrato squealed and leapt on the table. Something else had darted between his feet. Mark saw it streak across the floor and enter the scrum and wake the mass of interlocked terror into new and frantic convulsions. It was some kind of snake. Above the chaos of sounds which now awoke, there seemed to be a new animal in the room every minute. There came at last one sound in which those still capable of understanding could take comfort. Thud, thud, thud. The door was being battered from the outside. It was a huge folding door, a door by which a small locomotive could almost enter, for the room was made in imitation of Versailles. Already 1 or 2 of the panels were splintering. The noise maddened those who had made the door their goal. It seemed also to madden the animals. They did not stop to eat what they had killed, or not more than to take one lick of the blood. There were dead and dying bodies everywhere by now, for the scrum was by this time killing as many as the beasts, and always from all sides went up the voices trying to shout to those beyond the door, "Quick! Quick! Hurry!" but shouting only nonsense. Louder and louder grew the noise at the door. As if in imitation, a great gorilla leaped on the table where Jules had sat and began drumming on its chest. Then with a roar it leapt into the crowd. At last the door gave. Both wings gave. The passage, framed in the doorway, was dark. Out of the darkness there came a gray, snaky something. It swayed in the air, then began methodically to break off the splintered one on each side and make the doorway clear. Then Mark saw distinctly how it swooped down, curled itself round a man, steel, he thought, but everyone looked different now, and lifted him bodily high off the floor. After that, monstrous, improbable, the huge shape of the elephant thrust its way into the room, its eyes enigmatic, its ears standing stiffly out like the devil's wings on each side of its head. It stood for a second with steel writhing in the curl of its trunk, then dashed him to the floor. It trampled him. After it raised head and trunk again and brayed horribly, then plunged straight forward into the room, trumpeting and trampling, continually trampling like a girl treading grapes. heavily and soon wetly tramping in a pash of blood and bones, flesh, wine, fruit, and sodden tablecloth. Something more than danger darted from the sight into Mark's brain. The pride and insolent glory of the beast, the carelessness of its killings, seemed to crush his spirit even as its flat feet were crushing women and men. Here surely came the king of the world. Then everything went black, and he knew no more. When Mr. Bultitude had come to his senses, he had found himself in a dark place full of unfamiliar smells. This did not very greatly surprise or trouble him. He was inured to mystery. To poke his head into any spare bedroom at St. Anne's, as he sometimes managed to do, was an adventure no less remarkable than that which had now befallen him. And the smells here were, on the whole, promising. He perceived that food was in the neighborhood, and, more exciting still, a female of his own species. There were a great many other animals about, too, apparently, but that was rather irrelevant than alarming. He decided to go and find both the female bear and the food. It was then he discovered that walls met him in 3 directions, and bars in the 4th. He could not get out. This, combined with an inarticulate want for the human companionship to which he was accustomed, gradually plunged him into depression. Sorrow such as only animals know, huge seas of disconsolate emotion with not one little raft of reason to float on, drowned him fathoms deep. In his own fashion he lifted his voice and wept. And yet, not very far away from him, another and human captive was almost equally engulfed. Mr. Maggs, seated in a little white cell, chewed steadily on his great sorrow as only a simple man can chew. An educated man in his circumstances would have found misery streaked with reflection, would have been thinking how this new idea of cure instead of punishment, so humane in seeming, had in fact deprived the criminal of all rights, and taking away the name punishment made the thing infinite. But Mr. Maggs thought all the time simply of one thing, that this was the day he had counted on through all his sentence, that he had expected by this time to be having tea at home with Ivy. She'd have got something tasty for him the first night, and that it hadn't happened. He sat quite still. About once in every 2 minutes, a single large tear trickled down his cheek. He wouldn't have minded so much if they'd let him have a pack of fags. It was Merlin who brought release to both. He had left the dining room as soon as the curse of Babel was well fixed upon his enemies. No one had seen him go. Wither had once heard his voice calling loud and intolerably glad above the riot of nonsense.
Qui verbum Dei contempserunt, eis afferetur etiam verbum hominis.
After that he did not see him again, nor the tramp either. Merlin had gone and spoiled his house. He had liberated beasts and men. The animals that were already maimed he killed with an instantaneous motion of the powers within him, swift and painless as the mild shafts of Artemis. To Mr. Maggs he had handed a written message. It ran as follows. Dearest Tom, I do hope you're well, and the director here is one of the right sort, and he says to come as soon as you can to the manor at St. Anne's. And don't go through Edgestow, Tom, whatever you do, but come any way you can. I should think someone had given you a lift. Everything is all right. No more now. Lots of love. Ever your own, Ivy. The other prisoners he let go where they pleased. The tramp, finding Merlin's back turned to him for a second, and having noticed the house seemed empty, made his escape. First into the kitchen, and thence, reinforced with all the edibles his pockets would hold, into the wide world. I have not been able to trace him further. The beast, except for one donkey who disappeared about the same time as the tramp, Merlin is sent to the dining room, maddened with his voice and touch. But he retained Mr. Bultitude. The latter had recognized him at once as the same man whom had sat beside him in the blue room, less sweet and sticky than on that occasion, but recognizably the same. Even without the brilliantine, there was that in Merlin which exactly suited the bear, and at their meeting it made him all the cheer that a beast can make a man. He laid his hand on its head and whispered in its ear, and its dark mind was filled with excitement as though some long-forbidden and forgotten pleasure were suddenly held out to it. Down the long, empty passages of Belbury it padded behind him. Saliva dripped from its mouth, and it was beginning to growl. It was thinking of warm, salt tastes, of the pleasant resistances of bone, of things to crunch and lick and worry. Mark found himself shaken. Then the cold shock of water dashed in his face. With difficulty he sat up. The room was empty except for the bodies of the distorted dead. The unmoved electric light glared down on such hideous confusion. Food and filth, spoiled luxury and mangled men, each more hideous by reason of the other. It was the supposed Bosque priest who had roused him.
Surge missile,
it said, helping Mark to his feet. Mark rose. He had some cuts and bruises, and his head ached, but he was substantially uninjured. The man held out to him wine in one of the great silver cups, but Mark turned away from it with a shudder. He looked with bewilderment on the face of the stranger and found that a letter was being put into his hand. Your wife awaits you at the manor at St. Anne's on the hill. Come quickly. By road as best you can. Do not go near Edgestow. A. Dynaston. He looked again at Merlin and thought his face terrible, but Merlin met his glance with a look of unsmiling authority, laid a hand on his shoulder, and impelled him over all the tinkling and slippery havoc to the door. His fingers sent a prickly sensation through Mark's skin. He was led down to the cloakroom, made to fling on a coat and a hat, neither his own, and thence out under stars, bitter cold and 2 o'clock in the morning, Sirius bitter green, a few flakes of dry snow beginning to fall. He hesitated. The stranger stood back from him for a second, then with his open hand struck him on the back. Mark's bones ached at the memory as long as he lived. Next moment he found himself running as he had never run since boyhood, not in fear, but because his legs would not stop. When he became master of them again, he was half a mile from Belbury, and looking back, he saw a light in the sky. Wither was not among those killed in the dining room. He naturally knew all possible ways out of the room, and even before the coming of the tiger he had slipped away. He understood what was happening, if not perfectly, yet better than anyone else. He saw that the Basque interpreter had done the whole thing, and by that he knew also that powers more than human had come down to destroy Belbury. Only one in the saddle of whose soul rode Mercury himself could thus have unmade language. And this again told him something worse. It meant that his own dark masters had been completely out in their calculations. They had talked of a barrier which made it impossible that powers from deep heaven should reach the surface of the earth, had assured him that nothing from outside could pass the moon's orbit. All their polity was based on the belief that Tellus was blockaded, beyond the reach of such assistance, and left, as far as that went, to their mercy and his. Therefore he knew that all was lost. It is incredible how little this knowledge moved him. It could not, because he had long ceased to believe in knowledge itself. What had been in his far-off youth a merely aesthetic repugnance to realities that were crude or vulgar had deepened and darkened, year after year, into a fixed refusal of everything that was in any degree other than himself. He had passed from Hegel to Hume, thence through pragmatism, and thence through logical positivism, and out at last into complete void. The indicative mood now corresponded to no thought that his mind could entertain. He had willed with his whole heart that there should be no reality and no truth, and even the imminence of his own ruin could not wake him. The last scene of Dr. Faustus, where the man raves and implores on the edge of hell, is perhaps stage fire. The last moments before damnation are not often so dramatic. Often the man knows, with perfect clarity, that some still possible action of his will could save him, but he cannot make this knowledge real to himself. Some tiny habitual sensuality, some resentment too trivial to waste on a blue bottle, the indulgence of some fatal lethargy, seems to him at that moment more important than the choice between total joy and total destruction. With eyes wide open, seeing the endless terrors just about to begin, and yet, for the moment unable to feel terrified, he watches passively, not moving a finger for his own rescue, while the last links with joy and reason are severed, and drowsily sees the trap close upon his soul. So full of sleep are they at the time when they leave the right way. Strake and Philostrato were also still alive. They met in one of the cold, lighted passages, so far away from the dining room the noise of carnage was but a faint murmur. Philostrato was hurt, his right arm badly mauled. They did not speak, both knew the attempt would be useless, but walked on side by side. Philostrato was intending to get round to the garage by a back way. He thought he might still be able to drive, in a fashion, at least as far as Stirk. As they rounded a corner, they both saw what they had often seen before, but had expected never to see again. The deputy director stooped, creaking, pacing, humming his tune. Philostrato did not want to go with him, but Wither, as if noticing his wounded condition, offered him an arm. Philostrato tried to decline it. Nonsense syllables came from his mouth. Wither took his left arm firmly. Strake seized the other, the mauled arm. Squealing and shivering with pain, Philostrato accompanied them perforce. But worse awaited him. He was not an initiate. He knew nothing of the dark Eldilia. He believed that his skill had really kept Alcason's brain alive. Hence, even in his pain, he cried out with horror when he found the two drawing him through the anteroom of the head and into the head's presence, without pausing for any of those antiseptic preparations which he had always imposed on his colleagues. He tried vainly to tell them that one moment of such carelessness might undo all his work, but this time it was in the room itself that his conductors began undressing, and this time they took off all their clothes. They plucked his off, too. When the right sleeve, stiff with blood, would not move, Wither got a knife from the anteroom and ripped it. In the end, the three men stood naked before the head, gaunt, big-boned Strake, Philostrato, a wobbling mountain of fat, Wither, an obscene senility. Then the high ridge of terror from which Philostrato was never again to descend was reached. for what he thought impossible began to happen. No one had read the dials, adjusted the pressure, or turned on the air and the artificial saliva, yet words came from the dry, gaping mouth of the dead man's head.
"The door!"
Philostrato felt his companions forcing his body forward, then up again, then forward and downward a second time. He was compelled to bob up and down in rhythmic obeisance, the others meanwhile doing the same. Almost the last thing he saw on earth was the skinny folds on Wither's neck shaking like the wattles of a turkey cock. Almost the last thing he heard was Wither beginning to chant, then Strake joined in. Then, horribly, he found he was singing himself. Oroborindra, 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 Bahai! But not for long.
"Another! Bring me another head!"
Philostrato knew at once why they were forcing him to a certain place in the wall. He had devised it all himself. In the wall that separated the head's room from the antechamber there was a little shutter. When drawn back, it revealed a window in the wall and a sash to the window which would fall quickly and heavily, but the sash was a knife. The little guillotine had not been meant to be used like this. They were going to murder him uselessly, unscientifically. If he were doing it to one of them, all would have been different. Everything would have been prepared weeks before, the temperature of both rooms exactly right, the blades sterilized, the attachments all ready to be made almost before the head was severed. He had even calculated what changes the terror of the victim would probably make in his blood pressure. The artificial bloodstream would be arranged accordingly so as to take over its work with the least possible breach of continuity. His last thought was that he had underestimated the terror. The two initiates, red from top to toe, gazed at each other, breathing heavily. Almost before the fat, dead legs and buttocks of the Italian had ceased quivering, they were driven to begin the ritual again.
Oroborindra! 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 Bahai!
This same thought struck both of them at one moment.
"It will ask for another."
And Strake remembered Wither had a knife. He wrenched himself free from the rhythm with a frightful effort. Claws seemed to be tearing his chest from the inside. Wither saw what he meant to do. As Strake bolted, Wither was already after him. Strake reached the anteroom, slipped in Philostrato's blood. Wither slashed repeatedly with a knife. He had not strength to cut through the neck, but he killed the man. He stood up, pains gnawing at his old man's heart. Then he saw the Italian's head lying on the floor. It seemed to him good to pick it up and carry it to the inner room, show it to the original head. He did so. Then he realized that something was moving in the anteroom. Could it be they had not shut the outer door? He could not remember. They had come in forcing Philostrato along between them. It was possible. Everything had been so abnormal. He put down his burden, carefully, almost courteously, even now, and stepped toward the door between the two rooms. Next moment he drew back. A huge bear, rising on its hind legs as he came in sight of it, had met him in the doorway, its mouth open, its eyes flaming, its forepaws spread out as if for embrace. Was this what Strake had become? He knew, though even now he could not attend to it, that he was on the very frontier of a world where such things could happen. No one at Belbury that night had been cooler than Feverstone. He was neither an initiate like Wither nor a dupe like Philostrato. He knew about the macrobes, but it wasn't the sort of thing he was interested in. He knew that the Belbury scheme might not work, but he knew if it didn't, he would get out in time. He had a dozen lines of retreat kept open. He had also a perfectly clear conscience and had played no tricks with his mind. He had never slandered another man except to get his job, never cheated except because he wanted money, never really disliked people unless they bored him. He saw at a very early stage that something was going wrong. One had to guess how far wrong. Was this the end of Belbury? If so, he must get back to Edgestow and work up the position he had already prepared for himself as protector of the university against the NICE. On the other hand, if there were any chance of figuring as the man who had saved Belbury at a moment of crisis, that would definitely be the better line. He would wait as long as it was safe, and he waited a long time. He found a hatch through which hot dishes were passed from the kitchen passage into the dining room. He got through it and watched the scene. His nerves were excellent, and he thought he could pull and bolt the shutter in time if any dangerous animal made for the hatch. He stood there during the whole massacre, his eyes bright, something like a smile on his face, smoking endless cigarettes and drumming with his hard fingers on the sill of the hatch. When it was all over, he said to himself, "Well, I'm damned." It had certainly been a most extraordinary show. The beast had all streaked away somehow. He knew there was a chance of meeting one or two of them in the passages, but he'd have to risk that. Danger, in moderation, acted on him like a tonic. He worked his way to the back of the house and into the garage. It looked as if he must go to Edgestow at once. He could not find his car in the garage. Indeed, there were far fewer cars than he had expected. Apparently several other people had the idea of getting away while the going was good, and his own car had been stolen. He felt no resentment, and set about finding another of the same make. It took him a longish time, and when he had found one, he had considerable difficulty in starting her up. The night was cold. Going to snow, he thought. He scowled for the first time that night. He hated snow. It was after 2 o'clock when he got going. Just before he started, he had the odd impression that someone had got into the back of the car behind him. "Who's that?" he asked sharply. He decided to get out and see, but to his surprise, his body did not obey this decision. Instead, it drove the car out of the garage and round to the front and out into the road. The snow was definitely falling by now. He found he could not turn his head and could not stop driving. He was going ridiculously fast, too, in this damn snow. He had no choice. He'd often heard of cars being driven from the back seat, but now it seemed to be really happening. Then, to his dismay, he found he had left the road. The car, still at a reckless speed, was bumping and leaping along the way that was called Gypsum Lane, or, by the educated, Wayland Street, the old Roman road from Belbury to Edgestow, all grass and ruts. "Yeah! What the devil am I doing?" thought Feverstone. "Am I tight? I'll break my neck at this game if I don't look out." But on the car went as if driven by one who regarded this track as an excellent road and the obvious route to Edgestow. Frost had left the dining room a few minutes after Wither. He did not know where he was going or what he was about to do. For many years, he had theoretically believed that all which appears in the mind as motive or intention is merely a byproduct of what the body is doing. But for the last year or so, since he had been initiated, he had begun to taste as fact what he had long held as theory. Increasingly, his actions had been without motive. He did this and that, he said thus and thus, and did not know why. His mind was a mere spectator. He could not understand why the spectator should exist at all. He resented its existence, even while assuring himself that resentment also was chemical phenomenon. The nearest thing to a human passion which still existed in him was a sort of cold fury against all who believed in the mind. There was no tolerating such an illusion. There were not and must not be such things as men. But never until this evening had he been quite so vividly aware that the body and its movements were the only reality, that the self which seemed to watch the body leaving the dining room and setting out for the chamber of the head was a nonentity. How infuriating that the body should have the power thus to project a phantom self. Thus the Frost, whose existence Frost denied, watched his body go into the anteroom, watched it pull up sharply at the sight of a naked and bloodied corpse. The chemical reaction called shock occurred. Frost stooped, turned the body over, and recognized Strake. A moment later, his flashing pince-nez and pointed beard looked into the room of the head itself. He hardly noticed that Wither and Philostrato lay there dead. His attention was fixed by something more serious. The bracket where the head ought to have been was empty, the metal ring twisted, the rubber tubes tangled and broken. Then he noticed a head on the floor, stooped and examined it. It was Philostrato's. Of Alkison's head he found no trace, unless some mess of broken bones beside Philostrato's were it. Still not asking what he would do or why, Frost went to the garage. The whole place was silent and empty. The snow was thick on the ground by this. He came up with as many petrol tins as he could carry. He piled all the inflammables he could think of together in the objective room. Then he locked himself in by locking the outer doors of the anteroom. Whatever it was that dictated his actions then compelled him to push the key into the speaking tube which communicated with the passage. When he had pushed it as far in as his fingers could reach, he took a pencil from his pocket and pushed with that. Presently he heard the clink of the key falling on the passage floor outside. That tiresome illusion, his consciousness, was screaming to protest. His body, even had he wished, had no power to attend to those screams. Like the clockwork figure he had chosen to be, his stiff body, now terribly cold, walked back into the objective room, poured out the petrol, and threw a lighted match into the pile. Not till then did his controllers allow him to suspect that death itself might not after all cure the illusion of being a soul, nay, might prove the entry into a world where that illusion raged infinite and unchecked. Escape for the soul, if not for the body, was offered him. He became able to know, and simultaneously refuse the knowledge, that he had been wrong from the beginning, that souls and personal responsibility existed. He half saw, he wholly hated. The physical torture of the burning was not fiercer than his hatred of that. With one supreme effort, he flung himself back into his illusion. In that attitude, eternity overtook him, as sunrise in old tales overtakes and turns to unchangeable stone. Chapter 17. Daylight came with no visible sunrise as Mark was climbing to the highest ground in his journey. The white road, still virgin of human traffic, showed the footprints here and there of a bird and here and there a rabbit, for the snow shower was just then coming to its end in a flurry of larger and slower flakes. A big lorry, looking black and warm in the landscape, overtook him. The man put out his head.
Going Birmingham way, mate. Roughly. At least I'm going to St. Anne's.
Where's that?
Up on the hill behind Pennington.
I could take you to the corner, save you a bit.
It was the mid-morning when the man dropped him in a corner beside a little country hotel. The snow had all lain and there was more in the sky, and the day was extremely silent. Mark went into the little hotel and found a kind, elderly landlady. He had a hot bath and a capital breakfast, and then went to sleep in a chair before a roaring fire. He did not wake till about 4. He reckoned he was only a few miles from St. Anne's, and decided to have tea before he set out. He had tea. At the landlady's suggestion, he had a boiled egg with his tea. 2 shelves in the little sitting room were filled with bound volumes of The Strand. In one of these he found a serial children's story which he had begun to read as a child, but abandoned because his 10th birthday came when he was halfway through it, and he was ashamed to read it after that. Now he chased it from volume to volume till he had finished it. It was good. The grown-up stories to which, after his 10th birthday, he had turned instead of it, now seemed to him, except for Sherlock Holmes, to be rubbish.
I suppose I must get on soon,
he said to himself. His slight reluctance to do so did not proceed from weariness. He felt indeed perfectly rested, and better than he had felt for several weeks, but from a sort of shyness. He was going to see Jane, and Denniston, and probably the Dimbles as well. In fact, he was going to see Jane in what he now felt to be her proper world, but not his. He had now thought that with all his lifelong eagerness to reach an inner circle, he had chosen the wrong circle. Jane was where she belonged. He was going to be admitted only out of kindness, because Jane had been fool enough to marry him. He did not resent it, but he felt shy. He saw himself as the new circle must see him, as one more little vulgarian, just like the Steeles and the Cossers, dull, inconspicuous, frightened, calculating, cold. He wondered vaguely why he was like that. How did other people like Denniston or Dimble, find it so easy to saunter through the world with all their muscles relaxed and a careless eye roving the horizon, bubbling over with fancy and humor, sensitive to beauty, not continually on their guard, and not needing to be? What was the secret of that fine, easy laughter which he could not by any effort imitate? Everything about them was different. They could not even fling themselves into chairs without suggesting by the very posture of their limbs a certain lordliness, a leonine indolence. There was elbow room in their lives, as there had never been in his. They were hearts, he was only a spade. Still, he must be getting on. Of course, Jane was a heart. He must give her her freedom. It would be quite unjust to think that his love for her had been basely sensual. Love, Plato says, is the son of want. Mark's body knew better than his mind had known till recently, and even his sensual desires were the true index of something which he lacked, and Jane had to give. When she first crossed the dry and dusty world which his mind inhabited, she had been like a spring shower. In opening himself to it, he had not been mistaken. He had gone wrong only in assuming that marriage by itself gave him either power or title to appropriate that freshness. As he now saw, one might as well have thought one could buy a sunset by buying the field from which one had seen it. He rang the bell and asked for his bill. That afternoon, Mother Dimble and the 3 girls were upstairs in the big room which occupied nearly the whole top floor of one wing at the manor, and which the director called the wardrobe. If you had glanced in, you would have thought for one moment that they were not in a room at all, but in some kind of forest, a tropical forest, glowing with bright colors. A second glance and you might have thought they were in one of those delightful upper rooms at a big shop where carpets standing on end and rich stuffs hanging from the roof make a kind of woven forest of their own. In fact, they were standing amidst a collection of robes of state, dozens of robes which hung, each separate, from its little pillar of wood.
That would do beautifully for you, Ivy.
Mother Dimble lifted with one hand the fold of a vividly green mantle over which thin twists and spirals of gold played in a festive pattern.
Come, Ivy, don't you like it? You're not still fretting about Tom, are you? Hasn't the director told you he'll be here tonight or tomorrow midday at the latest?
Ivy looked at her with troubled eyes.
'Tisn't that. Where'll the director himself be?
But you can't want him to stay, Ivy. Not in continual pain. And his work will be done, if all goes well at Edgestow. He has longed to go back to Paralandra. He's sort of homesick. Always. Always. I could see it in his eyes.
And will that Merlin man come back here? I don't think so. I don't think either he or the director expected him to. And then in my dream last night, it looked as if he was on fire. I don't mean burning, you know, but light. All sorts of lights and the most curious colors shooting out of him and running up and down him. That was the last thing I saw. Merlin standing there like a kind of pillar, and all those dreadful things happening all round him. And you could see in his face that he was a man used up to the last drop, if you know what I mean. That he'd fall to pieces the moment the powers let him go.
We're not getting on with choosing our dresses for tonight. What is it made of?
Camilla felt and then smelled the green mantle. It was a question worth asking. It was not in the least transparent, yet all sorts of lights and shades dwelled in its rippling folds, and it flowed through Camilla's hands like a waterfall. Ivy became interested.
Gore! How much a yard would that be?
There.
Mother Dimble draped it skillfully around Ivy and then said,
Oh!
in genuine amazement. All three stood back from Ivy, staring with delight. The commonplace had not exactly gone from her form and face. The robe had taken it up, as a great composer takes up a folk tune and tosses it like a ball through the symphony and makes of it a marvel, yet leaves it still itself. A pert fairy, a dapper elf, a small though perfect sprightliness, stood before them, but still recognizably Ivy Maggs.
Isn't that like a man? There's not a mirror in the room.
I don't believe we were meant to see ourselves. He said something about being mirrors enough to see each other. I would just like to see what I'm like at the back.
Now, Camilla, there's no puzzle about you. This is obviously your one. Oh, do you think... that one?
Yes, of course.
It was a long, slender thing which looked like steel in color, though it was soft as foam to the touch. It wrapped itself close about her and flowed out in a glancing train at her heels.
Like a mermaid.
Thought Jane, and then...
Or like a Valkyrie.
I'm afraid you must wear a coronet with that one. Wouldn't that be rather...
But Mother Dimble was already setting it on her head. That reverence, it need have nothing to do with money value, which nearly all women feel for jewelry, hushed three of them for a moment. There were perhaps no such diamonds in England. The splendor was fabulous, preposterous.
What are you all staring at?
Camilla had seen but one flash as the crown was raised in Mrs. Dimble's hands, and did not know that she stood...
like starlight in the spoils of provinces. Are they real? Where did they come from, Mother Dimble?
Treasures of Logris, dear. Treasures of Logris. Perhaps from beyond the moon or before the flood. Now, Jane.
Jane could see nothing specially appropriate in the robe which the others agreed in putting on her. Blue was indeed her color, but she had thought of something a little more austere and dignified. Left to her own judgment, she would have called this a little fussy. But when she saw the others all clap their hands, she submitted. Indeed, it did not now occur to her to do otherwise, and the whole matter was forgotten a moment later in the excitement of choosing one for Mother Dimble.
Something quiet. I'm an old woman, and I don't want to be made ridiculous. This wouldn't do at all.
Camilla walked down a long row of hanging splendors, herself like a meteor as she passed against that background of purple and gold and scarlet, and soft snow and elusive opal, fur, silk, velvet, taffeta, and brocade.
That's lovely, but not for you. And, oh! Look at that. But it wouldn't do. I don't see anything.
Here! Oh, do come and look! Look, come here!
Cried Ivy as if she were afraid her discovery would run away unless the others attended it quickly.
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed.
Certainly.
Put it on, Mother Dimble. You know you got to.
It was of that almost tyrannous flame color which Jane had seen in her vision down in the lodge, but differently cut, with fur about the great copper brooch that clasped the throat, with long sleeves and hangings from them, and there went with it a many-cornered cap, and they had no sooner clasped the robe than all were astonished, none more than Jane, though indeed she had the best reason to foresee the result. For now this provincial wife of a rather obscure scholar, this respectable and barren woman, with grey hair and a double chin, stood before her, not to be mistaken, as a kind of priestess or sibyl, the servant of some prehistoric goddess of fertility, an old tribal matriarch, mother of mothers, grave, formidable, and august. A long staff, curiously carved as if a snake twined up in it, was apparently part of the costume. They put it in her hand. Mother Dimble looked in turn at the three silent faces.
Am I awful?
You look lovely.
It is exactly right.
Jane took up the old lady's hand and kissed it.
Darling, awful in the old sense is just what you do look.
What are the men going to wear?
They can't very well go in fancy dress, can they? Not if they're cooking and bringing things in and out all the time. And I must say, if this is to be the last night and all, I do think we ought to have done the dinner anyway. Let them do as they like about the wine. And what they'll do with that goose is more than I like to think, because I don't believe that Mr. McPhee ever roasted a bird in his life, whatever he says.
They can't spoil the oysters anyway.
That's right, nor the plum pudding, not really. Still, I'd like to go down and just take a look. You'd better not,
said Jane with a laugh.
You know what he's like when he's in charge of the kitchen. I'm not afraid of him,
said Ivy, almost but not quite putting out her tongue, and in her present dress the gesture was not uncomely.
You needn't be in the least worried about the dinner, girls. He will do it very well. Always provided he and my husband don't get into a philosophical argument just when they ought to be dishing up. Let's go and enjoy ourselves. How very warm it is in here.
It's lovely.
At that moment the whole earth shook from end to end.
What on earth's that? If the wall was still on, I'd have said it was a bomb.
Camilla regained her composure sooner than any of the others, and was now at the window, which looked west toward the Valley of the Wind.
Come and look. Oh, look. No, it's not fire. And it's not searchlights. And it's not forked lightning. Ugh. There's another shock. And there. Look at that. It's as bright as day there beyond the church. What am I talking about? It's only 3 o'clock. It's brighter than day. And the heat... it has begun.
At about the same time that morning, when Mark had climbed into the lorry, Feverstone, not much hurt but a good deal shaken, climbed out of the stolen car. That car had ended its course upside down in a deep ditch, and Feverstone, always ready to look on the bright side, reflected as he extricated himself that things might have been worse. It might have been his own car. The snow was deep in the ditch, and he was very wet. As he stood up and looked about him, he saw he was not alone. A tall, massive figure in a black cassock was before him, about 5 yards distant. Its back was toward him, and it was already walking away. "Hey!" shouted Feverstone. The other turned and looked at him in silence for a second or two, then resumed its walk. Feverstone felt at once that this was not the sort of man he would get on with. In fact, he had never liked the look of anyone less. Nor could he, in his broken and soaking pumps, follow the 4-mile-an-hour stride of those booted feet. He did not attempt it. The black figure came to a gate, there stopped and made a whinnying noise. He was apparently talking to a horse across the gate. Next moment, Feverstone did not quite see how this happened, the man was over the gate and on the horse's back and off at a canter across a wide field that rose milk-white to the skyline. Feverstone had no idea where he was, but clearly the first thing to do was reach a road. It took him much longer than he expected. It was not freezing now, and deep puddles lay hidden beneath the snow in many places. At the bottom of the first hill he came to such a morass that he was driven to abandon the track of the Roman road and try striking across the fields. The decision was fatal. It kept him for 2 hours looking for gaps in hedges and trying to reach things that looked like roads from a distance, but turned out to be nothing of the sort when one reached them. He had always hated the country and always hated weather, and he was not at any time fond of walking. Near 12 o'clock he found a road with no signpost that led him an hour later into the main road. Here, thank heavens, there was a fair amount of traffic, both cars and pedestrians, all going one way. The first 3 cars took no notice of his signals. The fourth stopped. "Quick! In you get," said the driver. "Going to Edgestow?" asked Feverstone, his hand on the door. "Good Lord, no," said the other. "There's Edgestow." And he pointed behind him. "If you want to go there." The man seemed surprised and considerably excited. In the end, there was nothing for it but walking. Every vehicle was going away from Edgestow, none going toward it. Feverstone was a little surprised. He knew all about the Exodus. Indeed, it had been part of his plan to clear the city as far as possible, but he had supposed it would be over by now. But all that afternoon, as he splashed and slipped through the churned snow, the fugitives were still passing him. We have naturally hardly any first-hand evidence for what happened in Edgestow that afternoon and evening. But we have plenty of stories as to how so many people came to leave it at the last moment. They filled the papers for weeks and lingered in private talks for months, and in the end became a joke. "No, I don't want to hear how you got out of Edgestow," came to be a catchphrase. But behind all the exaggerations, there remains the undoubted truth that a quite astonishing number of citizens left town just in time. One had a message from a dying father. Another had decided quite suddenly, and he couldn't just say why, to go and take a little holiday. Another went because the pipes in his house had been burst by the frost, and he thought he might as well go away till they were put right. Not a few of them had gone because of some trivial event which seemed to them an omen, a dream, a broken looking-glass, tea leaves in a cup. Omens of a more ancient kind had also revived during the crisis. One had heard his donkey, another her cat say, "Clear is clear, go away." And hundreds were still leaving for the old reason, because their houses had been taken from them, their livelihood destroyed, and their liberties threatened by the institutional police. It was at about 4 o'clock that Feverstone found himself flung on his face. That was the first shock. They continued, increasing in frequency during the hours that followed. Horrible shudderings, and soon heavings of the earth, and a growing murmur of widespread subterranean noise. The temperature began to rise. Snow was vanishing in every direction, and at times he was knee-deep in water. Haze from the melting snow filled the air. When he reached the brow of the last steep descent into Edgestow, he could see nothing of the city, only fog through which extraordinary coruscations of light came up to him. Another shock sent him sprawling. He now decided not to go down. He would turn and follow the traffic, work over to the railway and try to get to London. A picture of a steaming bath at his club, of himself at the fender of the smoking room telling this whole story, rose in his mind. It would be something to have survived both Belbury and Bracton. He had survived a good many things in his day, and believed in his luck. He was already a few paces down the hill when he made this decision, and he turned at once. But instead of going up, he found he was still descending. As if he were in shale on a mountain slope instead of a metalled road, the ground slipped away backwards where he trod on it. When he arrested his descent, he was 30 yards lower. He began again. This time he was flung off his feet, rolled head over heels, stones, earth, grass, and water pouring over him and round him in riotous confusion. It was as when a great wave overtakes you while you are bathing, but this time it was an earth wave. He got to his feet once again, set his face to the hill. Behind, the valley seemed to have been turned into hell. The pit of fog had been ignited and burned with blinding violet flame. Water was roaring somewhere, buildings crashing, mobs shouting. The hill in front of him was in ruins, no trace of road, hedge, or field, only a cataract of loose, raw earth. It was also far steeper than it had been. His mouth and hair and nostrils were full of earth. The slope was growing steeper as he looked at it. The ridge heaved up and up. The whole wave of earth rose, arced, trembled, and with all its weight and noise poured down on him. Dinner was over at St. Anne's, and they sat at their wine in a circle about the dining-room fire. As Mrs. Dimble had prophesied, the men had cooked it very well. Only after their serving was over and the board cleared had they put on their festal garments. Now all sat at ease and all diversely splendid, Ransom crowned at the right of the hearth, Grace Ironwood in black and silver opposite him. It was so warm that they had let the fire burn low, and in the candlelight the court dresses seemed to glow of themselves.
Why Logres, sir?
Tell them, Dimble. I will not talk much from now on.
Are you tired, sir? Is the pain bad?
No, Grace, it isn't that. But now that it's so nearly time for me to go, all this begins to feel like a dream. A happy dream, you understand. All of it, even the pain. I want to taste every drop. I feel as though it would be dissolved if I talked much. I suppose you've got to go, sir? My dear, what else is there to do? I've not grown a day or an hour older since I came back from Perelandra. There is no natural death to look forward to. The wound will only be healed in the world where it was got. All this has the disadvantage of being clean contrary to the observed laws of nature.
The director smiled without speaking, as a man who refuses to be drawn.
It is not contrary to the laws of nature. You are quite right. The laws of the universe are never broken. Your mistake is to think that the little irregularities we have observed on one planet for a few hundred years are the real unbreakable laws, whereas they are only the remote results which the true laws bring about more often than not, as a kind of accident. Shakespeare never breaks the real laws of poetry, but by following them, he breaks every now and then the little irregularities which critics mistake for the real laws. Then the little critics call it a license, but there's nothing licentious about it to Shakespeare.
And that is why nothing in nature is quite regular. There are always exceptions. A good, average uniformity, but not complete. Not many exceptions to the law of death have come my way.
And how? How should you expect to be there on more than one such occasion? Were you a friend of Arthur's or Barbarossa's? Did you know Enoch or Elijah?
Do you mean that the director, the Pendragon, is going where they went?
He will be with Arthur, certainly. I can't answer for the rest. There are people who have never died. We do not yet know why. We know a little more than we did about the how. There are many places in the universe, I mean, this same physical universe in which our planet moves, where an organism can last practically forever. Where Arthur is, we know. Where? In the third heaven, in Paralandra, in Athelen, the distant island which the descendants of Tor and Tenedril will not find for 100 centuries. Perhaps alone?
He hesitated and looked at Ransom, who shook his head.
And that is where Logris comes in, is it? Because he will be with Arthur.
Dimble was silent for a few moments, arranging and rearranging the fruit knife and fruit fork on his plate.
It all began when we discovered that the Arthurian story is mostly true history. There was a moment in the 6th century when something that is always trying to break through into this country nearly succeeded. Logris was our name for it. It will do as well as another. And then, gradually, we began to see all English history in a new way. We discovered the haunting. What haunting? How something we call Britain is always haunted by something we may call Logris. Haven't you noticed that we are 2 countries? After every Arthur, a Mordred. Behind every Milton, a Cromwell. A nation of poets, a nation of shopkeepers. The home of Sydney, and of Cecil Rhodes. Is it any wonder they call us hypocrites? But what they mistake for hypocrisy is really the struggle between Logris and Britain.
He paused and took a sip of wine before proceeding.
It was long afterwards, after the director had returned from the third heaven, that we were told a little more. This haunting turned out to be not only from the other side of the invisible wall. Ransom was summoned to the bedside of an old man then dying in Cumberland. His name would mean nothing to you if I told it. That man was the Pendragon, the successor of Arthur and Uther and Cassabelon. Then we learned the truth. There has been a secret Logris in the very heart of Britain all these years, an unbroken succession of Pendragons. That old man was the 78th from Arthur. Our director received from him the office and the blessings. Tomorrow we shall know, or tonight, who is to be the 80th. Some of the Pendragons are well known to history, though not under that name. Others you have never heard of. But in every age they and the little Logris which gathered around them have been the fingers which gave the tiny shove, or the almost imperceptible pull, to prod England out of the drunken sleep, or to draw her back from the final outrage into which Britain tempted her.
This new history of yours is a wee bit lacking in documents.
It has plenty, but you do not know the language they're written in. When the history of these last few months comes to be written in your language and printed and taught in schools, there will be no mention in it of you or me, nor of Merlin and the Pendragon and the planets. And yet in these months Britain rebelled most dangerously against Logris and was defeated only just in time.
Aye, and it could be right good history without mentioning you and me, or most of those present. I'd be greatly obliged if anyone would tell me what we have done, always apart from feeding the pigs and raising some very decent vegetables. You have done what was required of you. You've obeyed and waited. It will often happen like that. As one of the modern authors has told us, the altar must often be built in one place in order that the fire from heaven may descend somewhere else. But don't jump to conclusions. You may have plenty of work to do before a month is past. Britain has lost a battle, but she will rise again.
So that, meanwhile, is England. Just this swaying to and fro between Logris and Britain. Yes, don't you feel it? The very quality of England. If we've got an ass's head, it is by walking in a fairy wood. We've heard something better than we can do, but can't quite forget it. Can't you see it in everything English? A kind of awkward grace, a humble, humorous incompleteness. How right Sam Weller was when he called Mr. Pickwick an angel in gaiters. Everything here is either better or worse than...
Dimble!
Dimble, whose tone had become a little impassioned, stopped and looked toward him. He hesitated and, as Jane thought, almost blushed before he began again.
You're right, sir. I was forgetting what you have warned me always to remember. This haunting is no peculiarity of ours. Every people has its own haunter. There's no special privilege for England. No nonsense about a chosen nation. We speak about Logris because it is our haunting, the one we know about.
All this seems a very roundabout way of saying that there's good and bad men everywhere.
It's not a way of saying that at all. You see, McPhee, if one is thinking simply of goodness in the abstract, one soon reaches the fatal idea of something standardized, some common kind of life to which all nations ought to progress. Of course, there are universal rules to which all goodness must conform, but that's only the grammar of virtue. It's not where the sap is. He doesn't make two blades of grass the same, how much less two saints, two nations, two angels. The whole work of healing Tellus depends on nursing that little spark, on incarnating that ghost, which is still alive in every real people, and different in each. When Logris really dominates Britain, when the goddess Reason, the divine clearness, is really enthroned in France, when the order of heaven is really followed in China, why then it will be spring. But in the meantime, our concern is with Logris. We've got Britain down, but who knows how long we can hold her down. Edgestow will not recover from what is happening to her tonight, but there will be other Edgestows. I wanted to ask about Edgestow. Aren't Merlin and the Eldila a trifle, well, wholesale? Did all Edgestow deserve to be wiped out?
Who are you lamenting? The jobbing town council that have sold their own wives and daughters to bring the NICE to Edgestow?
Well, I don't know much about them. But in the university, even Bracton itself, we all knew it was a horrible college, of course. But did they really mean any great harm with all their fussy little intrigues? Wasn't it more silly than anything else?
Och, aye. They were only playing themselves. Kittens letting on to being tigers. But there was a real tiger about, and their play ended by letting her in. They've no call to complain if, when the hunter's after her, he lets them have a bit of lead in their guts, too. It'll learn them not to keep bad company.
Well then, the fellows of other colleges. What about Northumberland and Dukes?
I know. One's sorry for a man like Churchwood. I knew him well. He was an old dear. All his lectures were devoted to proving the impossibility of ethics, though in private life he'd have walked 10 miles rather than leave a penny debt unpaid. But all the same, was there a single doctrine practiced at Belbury which hadn't been preached by some lecturer at Edgestow? Of course, they'd never thought anyone would act on their theories. No one was more astonished than they when what they'd been talking of for years suddenly took on reality. But it was their own child coming back to them, grown up and unrecognizable, but their own.
I'm afraid it's all true, my dear. Trahison des clerks. None of us are quite innocent. That's nonsense, Cecil. You are all forgetting that nearly everyone except the very good, who were ripe for fair dismissal, and the very bad, had already left Edgestow. But I agree with Arthur. Those who have forgotten Logris sink into Britain. Those who call for nonsense will find that it comes.
At that moment she was interrupted. A clawing and whining noise at the door had become audible.
Open the door, Arthur.
A moment later the whole party rose to its feet with cries of welcome, for the new arrival was Mr. Bultitude.
Oh, I never did. The poor thing. And all over snow, too. I'll just take him down to the kitchen and get him something to eat. Wherever have you been, you bad thing? Just look at the state you're in.
For the third time in 10 minutes, the train gave a violent lurch and came to a standstill. This time the shock put all the lights out.
This is getting really a bit too bad,
said a voice in the darkness. The 4 other passengers in the first-class compartment recognized it as belonging to the well-bred, bulky man in the brown suit, the well-informed man whom at earlier stages of the journey had told everyone else where they ought to change and why one now reached Stirk without going through Stratford, and who it was that really connected the line.
It's serious for me. I had to be an Edgestab by now.
He got up, opened the window, and stared out into the darkness. Presently one of the other passengers complained of the cold. He shut the window and sat down.
We've already been here for 10 minutes.
Excuse me, 12.
Still the train did not move. The noise of 2 men quarreling in a neighboring compartment became audible. Silence followed again. Suddenly a shock flung them all together in the darkness. It was as if the train, going at full speed, had been unskillfully pulled up.
What the devil's that?
Open the doors! Has there been a collision?
It's all right. Putting on another engine, and doing it very badly. It's all these new engine drivers they've got lately.
Hello? We're moving.
It takes its time to get up speed.
Oh, you'll find this start making up for lost time in a minute.
I wish they'd put the lights on again.
We're not picking up speed.
We're losing it. Damn it, are we stopping again? No, we're still moving. Oh!
Once more a violent shock hit them. It was worse than the last one. For nearly a minute everything seemed to be rocking and rattling.
This is outrageous!
Exclaimed the well-informed man, once more opening the window. This time he was more fortunate. A dark figure waving a lantern was walking past them.
Hey, Porter! Guard!
It's all right, ladies and gentlemen. It's all right. Keep your seats.
Shouted the dark figure, marching past and ignoring him.
It's no good letting all that cold air in, sir.
There's some sort of light ahead.
Signal against us?
No, not a bit like that. The whole sky's lit up. Like a fire, as searchlights.
I don't care what it's like, if only...
Another shock, and then far away in the darkness, vague, disastrous noise. The train began to move again, still slowly, as if groping its way.
I'll make a row about this. It's a scandal.
About half an hour later, the lighted platform of Sturk slowly loomed alongside.
Station announcer calling. Please keep your seats for an important announcement. Slight earthquake shock and floods have rendered the line to Edgestowe impassable. No details available. Passengers for Edgestowe are advised.
The well-informed man, who was Curry, got out. Such a man always knows all the officials on a railway, and in a few minutes he was standing by the fire in the ticket collector's office, getting a further and private report of the disaster.
Well, don't know exactly yet, Mr. Curry. There's been nothing coming through for about an hour. It's very bad, you know. They're putting the best face on it they can. There's never been an earthquake like that in England, from what I can hear. And there's the floods too, sir. No, sir. I'm afraid you'll find nothing of Bracton College. All that part of the town went almost at once. It began there, I understand. I don't know what the casualties will be. I'm glad I got my old dad out last week.
Curry always in later years regarded this as one of the turning points of his life. He had not till then been a religious man, but the word that now instantly came to his mind was providential. You couldn't really look at it any other way. He'd been within an ace of taking the earlier train, and if he had, he'd be a dead man by now. It made one think. The whole college wiped out. It would have to be rebuilt. There'd be a complete new set of fellows now, a new warden. It was providential again that some responsible person should have been spared to deal with such a tremendous crisis. There couldn't be an ordinary election, of course. The college visitor, who was the Lord Chancellor, would probably have to appoint a new warden, and then, in collaboration with him, a nucleus of new fellows. The more he thought of it, the more fully Curry realized that the whole shaping of the future college rested with the sole survivor. It was almost like being a second founder. Providential. He saw already in imagination the portrait of that second founder in the new-built hall, his statue in the new-built quadrangle, the long, long chapter consecrated to him in the college history. All this time without the least hypocrisy. Habit and instinct had given his shoulders just such a droop, his eyes such a solemn sternness, his brow such a noble gravity, as a man of good feeling might be expected to exhibit on hearing such news. The ticket collector was greatly edified.
You could see he felt it bad, but he could take it. He's a fine old chap.
As he had said afterward. Before Curry left, he asked,
When is the next train to London? I must be in town first thing tomorrow morning.
Ivy Maggs, it will be remembered, had left the dining room for the purpose of attending to Mr. Bultitude's comfort. It therefore surprised everyone when she returned in less than a minute with a wild expression on her face.
Come quick, someone, come quick. There's a bear in the kitchen. A bear? Ivy, but of course. I don't mean Mr. Bultitude, sir. There's a strange bear. Another one. Indeed. And it's eaten up all that was left of the goose and half the ham and all the junket, and now it's lying along the table eating everything as it goes along, and wriggling from one dish to another, and breaking all the crockery. Oh, do come quick, there'll be nothing left. And what line is Mr. Bultitude taking about all this, Ivy? Well, that's just what I want someone to come and see. He's carrying on something dreadful, sir. I've never seen anything like it. First of all, he just stood lifting up his legs in a funny way as if he thought he could dance, which we all know he can't, and now he's got up on the dresser and on his hind legs, and he's kind of bobbing up and down, making the awfullest noise, squeaking like, and he's putting one foot into the plum pudding already, and he got his head all mixed up in a string of onions, and I can't do nothing with him, I really can't. This is very odd behavior for Mr. Bultitude. You don't think, my dear, that the stranger might be a she-bear? Oh, don't say that, sir. I think that's the truth, Ivy. I strongly suspect that this is the future Mrs. Bultitude. It'll be the present Mrs. Bultitude if we sit here talking about it much longer. Ah, dear, what shall we do? I am sure Mr. Bultitude is quite equal to the situation. At present, the lady is refreshing herself. Sin sire et spatio, Dimble. We can trust them to manage their own affairs. No doubt, but not in our kitchen. Ivy, my dear, you must be very firm. Go into the kitchen and tell the strange bear I want to see her. You wouldn't be afraid, would you? Afraid? Not me. I'll show her who's the director around here. Not that it isn't only natural for her.
What's the matter with that jackdaw?
I think it's trying to get out. Shall I open the window? It's warm enough to have the window open anyway.
Another love affair. It sounds as if Jack had found a Jill. What a delicious night.
For as the curtains swelled and lifted over the open window, all the freshness of a midsummer night seemed to be blowing into the room. At that moment, a little further off, came the sound of whinnying.
Hello. The old mare is excited too. Shh. Listen. There's a different horse.
It's a stallion.
This is becoming indecent. On the contrary, decent, in the old sense, descends. Fitting is just what she is. Venus herself is over St. Anne's.
She comes more near the earth than she was wont to make men mad.
She's nearer than any astronomer knows. The work at Edgestow is done. The other gods have withdrawn. She waits still, and when she returns to her sphere, I will ride with her.
Suddenly, in the semi-darkness, Mrs. Dimble's voice cried sharply,
Look out! Look out! Cecil, I'm sorry. I can't stand bats. They'll get in my hair.
The voices of the two bats could be heard as they flickered to and fro above the candles. Because of their shadows, they seemed to be 4 bats instead of 2.
You'd better go, Margaret. You and Cecil had both better go. I shall be gone very soon now. There is no need of long goodbyes.
I really think I must go. I can't stand bats.
Comfort Margaret, Cecil. No, do not stay. I'm not dying. Seeing people off is always folly. It's neither good mirth nor good sorrow.
You mean us to go, sir?
Go, my dear friends. Erendi Meleldil.
He laid his hand on their heads. Cecil gave his arm to his wife, and they went.
Here she is, sir,
said Ivy Maggs, re-entering the room a moment later, flushed and radiant. A bear waddled at his side, its muzzle white with junket and its cheeks sticky with gooseberry jam.
And, sir. What is it, Ivy? Please, sir, it's poor Tom. It's my husband, and if you don't mind... You've given him something to eat and drink, I hope? Well, yes, I have. There wouldn't have been nothing if those 2 bears had been there much longer. What has Tom got, Ivy? I gave him the cold pie and the pickles. He always was a great one for pickles. And the end of the cheese and a bottle of stout. And I've put the kettle on so we can make ourselves, so as he can make himself a nice cup of tea. And he's enjoying it ever so, sir. And he said, would you mind him not coming up to say how do you do? Because he was never much of a one for company, if you take my meaning.
All that time the strange bear had been standing perfectly still with its eyes fixed on the director. He laid his hand on its flat head.
Erendi Meleldil, you are a good bear. Go to your mates. But here he is.
For at that moment the door, which was already a little ajar, was pushed further open to admit the inquiring and slightly anxious face of Mr. Bultitude.
Take her, Bultitude, but not in the house. Jane, open the other window. The French window? It's like a night in July.
The window swung open, and the 2 bears went blundering out into the warmth and wetness. Everyone noticed how light it had become.
Are these birds all daft that they're singing at 11:45? No, they're sane. Now, Ivy, you want to go and talk to Tom. Mother Dimble has put you both in the little room halfway up the stairs. Not in the lodge, after all. Sir.
The director leaned forward and laid his hand on her head.
Of course you want to go. Why, he's hardly had time to see you in your new dress yet. Have you no kisses to give him? Then give him mine, which are not mine, but by derivation. Don't cry. You are a good woman. Go and heal this man. Erendi Meleldil, we shall meet again. What's all yon squealing and squeaking? I hope it's not the pigs got loose, For I tell you, there's already as much carrying on about this house and garden as I can stand.
I think it's hedgehogs.
That last sound was somewhere in the house. Listen.
For a short time all were still. Then his face relaxed into a smile.
It's my friends behind the wainscot. There are revels there, too.
Zuget es in Snutzer Putzaisel, das Innen und Tanzen die Maiusel.
I suppose,
said McFay dryly, producing his snuff-box from under the ash-colored and slightly monastic-looking robe in which, contrary to his judgment, the others had seen fit to clothe him.
I suppose we may all think ourselves lucky that no giraffes, hippopotami, elephants, or the like have seen fit. God almighty, what's that?
As he spoke, a long gray flexible tube came in between the swaying curtains and, passing over McFay's shoulder, helped itself to a bunch of bananas.
In the name of hell, where'd all these beasts come from? They are the liberated prisoners from Belbury. She comes more near the earth than she is wont to make earth sane. Paralandra is all about us, and man is no longer isolated. We are now as we ought to be, between the angels who are our elder brothers, and the beasts who are our jesters, servants, and playfellows.
Whatever McFay was attempting to say in reply was drowned by an ear-splitting noise from beyond the window.
Elephants? 2 of them. Oh, the celery and the rose beds. By your leave, Mr. Director, I'll just draw these curtains. You seem to forget there are ladies present.
No, there will be nothing unfit for anyone to see. Draw them wider. How light it is. Brighter than moonlight, almost brighter than day. A great dome of light stands over the whole garden. Look, the elephants are dancing. How high they lift their feet. And they go round, and oh, look, how they lift their trunks, and how ceremonial they are. It is like a minuet of giants. They are not like the other animals. They are a sort of good daemons. They are moving away.
They will be as private as human lovers. They are not common beasts. I think I'll away down to my office and cast some accounts. I'd feel easier in my mind if I were inside and the door locked before any crocodiles or kangaroos start courting in the middle of all my files. There'd better be one man about the place keeping his head this night, for the rest of you are clean daft. Good night, ladies. Goodbye, McFay.
McFay stood well back and extended his hand.
No. You'll speak none of your blessings over me. If ever I take to religion, it won't be your kind. My uncle was moderator of the General Assembly, but there's my hand, what you and I have seen together. But no matter for that. And I'll say this, Dr. Ransom, that with all your faults, and there's no man alive knows them better than myself, you are the best man, taking you by and large, that ever I knew or heard of. You and I. But there are the ladies crying. I don't rightly know what I was going to say. I'm away this minute. Why would a man want to lengthen it? God bless you, Dr. Ransom. Ladies, I'll wish you a good night. Open all the windows. The vessel in which I must ride is now almost within the air of this world. It is growing brighter every minute. Can we be with you to the very end? Child, you should not stay till then. Why, sir? You were waited for. Me, sir? Yes. Your husband is waiting for you in the lodge. It was your own marriage chamber that you prepared. Should you not go to him? Must I go now? If you leave the decision with me, it is now that I would send you. Then I will go, sir. But, am I a bear or a hedgehog? More, but not less. Go in obedience, and you will find love. You will have no more dreams. Have children instead. Orendi Maleldil.
Long before he reached St. Anne's, Mark had come to realize either he himself or else the world about him was in a very strange condition. The journey took him longer than he expected, but that was perhaps fully accounted for by 1 or 2 mistakes that he had made. Much harder to explain was the horror of lights to the west, over Edgestow, and the throbbings and bouncings of the earth. Then came a sudden warmth and the torrents of melted snow rolling down the hillside. Everything became a mist, and then, as the lights in the west vanished, this mist grew softly luminous in a different place, above him as though the light rested on St. Anne's. And all the time he had the curious impression that things of very diverse shapes and sizes were slipping past him in the haze. Animals, he thought. Perhaps it was all a dream. Perhaps it was the end of the world, or perhaps he was dead. But in spite of all perplexities, he was conscious of extreme well-being. His mind was ill at ease, but as for his body, health and youth and pleasure and longing seemed to be blowing toward him from the cloudy light upon the hill. He never doubted that he must keep on. His mind was not at ease. He knew he was going to meet Jane, and something was beginning to happen to him, which ought to have happened to him far earlier. That same laboratory outlook upon love which had forestalled in Jane the humility of a wife had equally forestalled in him, during what passed for courtship, the humility of a lover. Or if there had ever arisen in him at some wiser moment the sense of beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear, he had put it away from him. False theories, at once prosaic and fanciful, had made it seem to him a mood frowsty, unrealistic, and outmoded. Now belated, after all favors had been conceded, the unexpected misgivings were coming upon him. He tried to shake them off. They were married, weren't they? And they were sensible, modern people. What could be more natural, more ordinary? But then certain moments of unforgettable failure in their short married life rose in his imagination. He had thought often enough of what he called Jane's moods. This time at last he thought of his own clumsy importunity. And the thought would not go away. Inch by inch, all the lout and cloud and clodhopper in him was revealed to his own reluctant inspection. The coarse male boor, with horny hands and hobnailed shoes and beefsteak jaw, not rushing in, for that can be carried off, but blundering, saundering, stumping in where great lovers, knights, and poets would have feared to tread. An image of Jane's skin, so smooth, so white, or so he imagined it, that a child's kiss might leave a mark, floated before him. How had he dared? Her driven snow, her music, her sacrosanctity, the very style of all her movements. How had he dared? And dared, too, with no sense of daring, nonchalantly, in careless stupidity. The very thoughts that crossed her face from moment to moment, all of them beyond his reach, made, had he but the wit to see it, a hedge about her, which such as he should never have had the temerity to pass. Yes, of course it was she who had allowed him to pass, perhaps in luckless, misunderstanding pity, and he had taken blackguardly advantage of that noble error in her judgment, had behaved as if here native to that fenced garden and ever its natural possessor. All this, which should have been uneasy joy, was torment to him, for it came too late. He was discovering the hedge after he had plucked the rose, and not only plucked it, but torn it all to pieces and crumbled it with hot, thumb-like greedy fingers. How had he dared? And who that understood could forgive him? He knew now that he must look in the eyes of her friends and equals. Seeing that picture, he grew hot to the forehead, alone there in the mist. The word lady had made no part of his vocabulary, save as a pure form or else in mockery. He had laughed too soon. Well, he would release her. She would be glad to be rid of him. Rightly glad. It would now almost have shocked him to believe otherwise. Ladies in some noble and spacious room, discoursing in cool ladyhood together, either with exquisite gravity or with silver laughter. How should they not be glad when the intruder had gone? The loud-voiced or tongue-tied creature, all boots and hands, whose true place was in the stable. What should he do in such a room, where his very admiration could only be an insult? His best attempts to be either grave or gay could only reveal unbridgeable misunderstanding. What he had called her coldness seemed now to be her patience, whereof the memory scalded. For he loved her now, but it was all spoiled. Too late to mend matters. Suddenly the diffused light brightened and flushed. He looked up and perceived a great lady standing by a doorway in the wall. It was not Jane. Not like Jane. It was larger, almost gigantic. It was not human, though it was like a woman divinely tall, part naked, part wrapped in a flame-colored robe. Light came from it. The face was enigmatic, ruthless, he thought, inhumanly beautiful. It was opening the door for him. He did not dare disobey.
Surely, I must have died.
And he went in. Found himself in some place of sweet smells and bright fires, with food and wine and a rich bed. Jane went out of the big house with the director's kiss upon her lips and his words in her ears, into the liquid light and supernatural warmth of the garden, and across the wet lawn. Birds were everywhere, and past the seesaw and the greenhouse, and the piggeries, going down all the time, down to the lodge, descending the ladder of humility. First she thought of the director, and then of Maleldil. Then she thought of her obedience, and the setting of each foot before the other became a kind of sacrificial ceremony. She thought of children, pain, and death. And now she was halfway to the lodge, and thought of Mark and all his sufferings. When she came to the lodge, she was surprised to see it all dark and the door shut. As she stood at the door with one hand on the latch, a new thought came to her. How if Mark did not want her? Not tonight, nor in that way, nor any time, nor in any way. How if Mark were not there after all? A great gap, of relief or disappointment, no one could say, was made in her mind by this thought. Still, she did not move the latch. Then she noticed the window, the bedroom window, was open. Clothes were piled on a chair inside the room so carelessly that they lay over the sill. The sleeve of a shirt, Mark's shirt, even hung down over the outside wall. And in all this damp, too. How exactly like Mark. Obviously, it was high time she went in.
Urendi Maleldil.